Oh, I stopped in there, but I had to go to, I had a fundraiser that night. I was running there. Yeah, I got a chance to stop by and get a photo. Yeah, good morning. I want to thank everyone for being here. My name is Derek Green. I'm the chair of the Council Committee on the Disabled and Persons with Special Needs. To my right is my colleague and committee member, Councilwoman Janie Blackwell. I know other council members will be coming. This is a busy time of the year, not only as a holiday season, but we're about to wrap up our legislative session next week. So we do anticipate other members of council coming in to this hearing. This resolution is an important conversation because many of the people in the city of Philadelphia rely upon those who are first responders and those that provide aid and assistance to people all around the city of Philadelphia. Too often we don't think about what are the issues and concerns and trauma that they deal with in doing the vital jobs they do every day, and the secondary trauma. I had an opportunity to see a documentary that talked about secondary trauma and really learn about the issue. We also participated in having a documentary done at District Council 47 because the first responders and those that care for those who are young people in the city of Philadelphia are dealing with secondary trauma issues as well. So this is a very important issue and a concern that's often not discussed and not talked about in a more public way. And so for me, as chair of this committee, I thought it was very important to have this conversation and really put this issue more at the forefront as we try to provide assistance and support those who are our first responders and those that put their lives on the line every day in a physical way as well as an emotional way, and really try to help some of the most vulnerable people in our city. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of those that provide the services that we rely upon every day for the work that they do. And this is one step in trying to acknowledge that and also acknowledge some of the challenges they deal with in some of the things they see every day in their work lives. So with that, I will have the clerk read the title to the resolution.
Resolution 180041, authorizing the Committee on Disabled and Persons with Special Needs to hold hearings regarding professional and family caregivers and first responders in the city of Philadelphia.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. We'll start with the first panel, and apologize if I mispronounce anyone's first or last name. Dr. Senhaya Inyagar, Dr. Sandra Bloom, and Robert Reed. If you could come up to the podium. And we'll proceed in that order.
Good morning, council members. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of secondary traumatic stress. Thank you especially to Councilman Green's office for your support and spearheading this Take Care PHL initiative. My name is Sandhya Iyengar, and I am a pediatrician at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I specialize in the care of children with developmental disabilities. I am part of the Philadelphia ACE Task Force, which aims to raise awareness about the lifelong impact of childhood adversity on health and well-being. A smaller group of us formed the Policy and Advocacy Work Group, and together we've been conceptualizing what the city of Philadelphia can do to rise to the challenge of supporting individuals who have dedicated their lives to the service and protection of others. The Take Care PHL initiative was born out of this idea that as a city, we can do more to take care of each other. Our panel's purpose today is to illuminate the nature of secondary traumatic stress, its impact on our city, and the ways we can move forward to address it. Secondary traumatic stress is experienced by professionals who regularly bear witness to other people's distressing situations, and by empathizing with them, these caregivers are in turn affected by the trauma. This is a natural and common, yet thoroughly disruptive, byproduct of daily work. Many types of professionals are susceptible to it, such as firefighters and law enforcement, social workers, teachers, and mental health workers. Our panelists will expound on secondary traumatic stress in further detail. We can all agree that its cost on the personal and professional lives of caregivers is too steep. In a survey of first responders, 37% affirmed that they have contemplated suicide, compared to the national average of 3.7%. This highlights the swift action needed to protect some of our city's bravest. I volunteered as an emergency medical technician for years before medical school. The rewards of this life-saving work brought me a deep joy and purpose. Like so many others in helping professions, I was wholly committed in the care of those in front of me. The sacrifice of showing up and serving, regardless of personal circumstance, that's what the community depends upon. However, over time, I saw, in myself and others, how the wear and tear of managing other people's intense trauma could whittle a caregiver away. After pulling survivors from wrecked cars, I was surprised to find myself jumping at the hard screech of tires. Thus, we caregivers vicariously endure the survivor's shock. This morning, you will hear several panelists present their personal stories about this insidious burden of supporting others. None of us are immune. Many of us have or will experience this phenomenon, whether or not we know what to call it. The Take Care PHL initiative envisions a future in which all employees throughout the city are shielded from secondary traumatic stress. You will hear several panelists speak about models of care that strive to do exactly that. Ultimately, we can embrace the duty of supporting those who work directly with traumatized populations. We can help the caregivers manage the physical, emotional, and psychological toll they are enduring. Philadelphia has the opportunity to lead the country in this area. We can be at the forefront of defining a new culture in which we take care of each other. Council members, thank you for your time and your attention this morning. On behalf of the ACE Task Force and the Policy Work Group, we appreciate your consideration of this important issue.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for holding these hearings and the resolution. It's really fitting, I think, that we are providing this testimony 70 years to the day.
Excuse me, Dr. Bloom, can you give your name for the record?
I'm sorry.
Your name for the record, I'm sorry.
Oh, Sandra Bloom.
Thank you.
It's fitting that we are providing this testimony 70 years to the day after one of the most traumatic experiences this nation has had, of course, Pearl Harbor. So I want to explain secondary traumatic stress through the long lens of history. Stress as a concept has been around for a couple hundred years. It's not new. But the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress as applied to combat survivors wasn't really created until 1980. And the first book about secondary traumatic stress wasn't published until 1995. Because by that time, there was a growing recognition that engaging with the memories and the emotions of other people who had experienced traumatic events was really having a disturbing effect on family members, caregivers, and service providers of those survivors. It was in the 1980s that interdisciplinary national and international organizations brought people together representing many different survivor groups. And what emerged was a growing understanding about the near universal exposure to traumatizing experience and the impact that that was having on human service providers. Research into traumatic stress really showed us how inadequate our understanding had been up to that time. And this research synchronized with calls for much more widespread social, economic, and political awareness about the context of human experience and the post-World War II world that we were living in, including the Cold War and the human rights movement. It certainly wasn't that trauma was new. Exposure to trauma is as old as humanity. But science was revealing new knowledge about the role of emotions in human experience and the multiple ways that we affect each other. We affect each other's bodies, our emotions, our social adaptation, and our spirits from cradle to grave. And we didn't know that before we had that science. Prior to an understanding of traumatic stress, it was really easy for anyone in a service occupation to kind of maintain an objective distance from the suffering of other people, because explanations for emotional and behavioral disturbance centered on problems that were in the individual person, and that were really only incidentally related to the outside world. There was something wrong with them, but the rest of us were just fine. Emotional problems, behavioral problems, and faulty adjustment was probably the result of genes and chemical problems or just deficiencies within the person. The causes were clearly individual. If combat veterans couldn't adequately reintegrate into society after warfare, it's because they were already weak and incapable before combat. Child abuse, especially child sexual abuse, was thought to be very rare. If women were depressed or abusing drugs and alcohol or homeless, we didn't see that there was a past history of rape or that they were still in situations of domestic violence. Firefighters, police officers, EMTs, doctors, and nurses were thought to be in those professions because they could handle things and were not expected to experience any negative consequences of their work. There were no lifespan studies, so we had no scientific knowledge about the ways in which traumatic exposure, as well as the relentless stress of poverty and discrimination and violence, can affect people across the lifespan. We didn't know about the enormous physical toll that exposure to trauma takes on our bodies, on our brains, on our relationships, and on our view of ourselves. And we didn't realize what was at stake at a moral level. Different terms have been used by different survivor groups to describe this, what's called the cost of caring. Compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, indirect trauma, and what we're using today, secondary traumatic stress. It really refers to the natural consequent behaviors and emotions that results from knowledge about a traumatizing event experienced by another person. It's the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or a suffering person. The traumatizing event experienced by one person becomes a traumatic event for the second person. Every service provider bears witness via their own experience of secondary traumatic stress to the toll trauma takes on mind, body, and spirit. The multiple symptoms of secondary traumatic stress that are temporary can become permanently manifest through burnout, and the results of that on the workforce are not good. Absenteeism, increased job turnover, low productivity, decreased job satisfaction, reduced commitment to the job, negative effect on people's home life and on their life in the community, and many, many, many physical problems. The science of exposure to chronic stress, adversity, and trauma is what I've called the science of suffering. And the social secret that has been uncovered is that most of this suffering is entirely preventable if we have the social and the political will to stop it. The fundamental question confronting us is, it's not what's wrong, it's what happened, if we are to understand our history and each other. If we're to have a healthier workforce and a healthier city, then we have to consider a public health approach to the issue of trauma and create what in public health we call universal precautions. Thank you very much for listening.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Robert Reed. I'm with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office, and I must say I always agree with everything that Dr. Bloom says. So let me just say that my presentation is a little bit different because I have been in law enforcement almost my entire adult life. And I was a federal prosecutor. I was an assistant U.S. attorney and member of the Department of Justice going back to the early 1980s. In fact, I was appointed when President Carter was in office. So it's given me a certain view of the stresses and the issues and the challenges that people, particularly in law enforcement, first responders, in criminal justice, have to deal with. So I'm going to focus on that. Let me just say that 3 years ago, I spoke at a conference, a small conference in Washington, with police chiefs from across the nation, who were from cities such as San Bernardino and Orlando and Dallas, and some of the other locations where people had faced extraordinarily horrendous, tragic mass shootings. And the police chiefs talked about the impact on particularly law enforcement on those incidents. And I remember the one in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando where the chief said it was bad for and hard for the police officers who came to the scene to see 49 people lying dead on the cold dance floor. But what made it much worse was actually hearing their cell phones going off and knowing that people were trying to find out if their loved ones had died. After hearing this for several hours, and of course, I was scraping myself off the floor listening to these horrible stories, I did mention to these chiefs, what about the officer who is facing this stress in a smaller way, but no less impactful way every day? I know because of the work I've done on gun violence for so many years that more than 25,000 people have been shot in Philadelphia since 9/11. More than 5,000 people have been murdered on the streets of Philadelphia. That's a lot of people, and we're not even talking about addiction. And we're not talking about, what we are talking about now is officers scooping, literally they call it scooping, people who've been shot, putting them in the back seats of their police vehicle, and rushing them to the hospital just to try to save a life, which is a great thing. But when that patient, the victim, is placed on the gurney and brought into the emergency room, the officer cleans the back seat of the car and sees that the blood's there and whatever else is there. It has a profound impact. And depending on each person's resilience and what's going on, it can have a long-lasting impact. We know that there's both trauma and vicarious trauma. And we don't know, frankly, if we had 100 officers here, what their backgrounds were, what their life experiences were, whether they experienced high levels of adverse childhood experiences when they were kids, whether they had been impacted, when their brain development had been affected. We don't know that. But we have to take people as we find them, and what happens is that when you get into these very, very stressful environments where we see officers going into, or firefighters or emergency medical technicians going into all the time, they have to deal with the reality that they're seeing somebody who's dying, could be dying, they could be interrupting a domestic violence incident. All of these things are going on, and it requires us to really take a very serious look at what we can do to try to reduce that stress and help those people who are serving the public. It's critical. The International Association of Chiefs of Police said policing is a demanding, often stressful career. On a daily basis, officers can be exposed to the worst humankind has to offer. They are called upon to make life and death decisions in a split second, and margins for error are slim. Despite these known stressors, officer mental health is an often overlooked component of officer safety and wellness. And, the Office of Victims of Crime at the Department of Justice has recognized this. It's obvious. And I will say that working with some great trauma experts in Philadelphia, we did do some trainings in Philadelphia of police officers back in the last number of years in the 22nd District and the 16th District, and we found that many of the officers really wanted mental health support. They were afraid to go to employee assistance because they felt if they went there, anything that they did or said could be revealed to their supervisors and could jeopardize their career. But they felt that it was essential that they have this kind of support. And actually, some of the doctors who actually were there sensed that some of the officers actually had full-blown PTSD. The bottom line is that the officers need help, and so do firefighters. I have somebody in my office whose father actually was probably suffering from trauma, and it wasn't until she heard from Dr. Bloom in a lecture that she actually learned about this and talked to her father, who's now receiving care for the first time after a 30-year career. I could go on for about 50 hours. I don't think you've got that time, but I will say this, that there are other professions, such as lawyers and judges, who have created organizations. There's Lawyers Concerned for Justice, which actually provide the kinds of care and support, peer support, that's essential to help people recover or at least begin to face the issues that they're going through. And I believe that unless we do this, unless we really support our police, we don't know, and again, firefighters and other things, we don't know what the ramifications are specifically for a given officer of what will happen. But what we do know is, and I think we see this nationally, sometimes an officer or a person loses it. And we see through domestic violence or something else, we see officers become addicted to drugs or alcohol. We see attempts for suicide. We see domestic violence. We see actual violence. We can help stop this. As Dr. Bloom has said today and many times, we can prevent this, but we need to actually focus on it like we're doing today and put the resources there to actually help police and other first responders be able to respond appropriately to help them so that they can help the public. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for your testimony this morning. As I was listening to the comments made by the panel, it made me reflect on a couple different scenarios. One, having two uncles who both worked in law enforcement, actually three uncles that worked in law enforcement, two as police officers and one for First Judicial District in the Warrant Unit. Those two uncles who were brothers, both were in Vietnam, and so they dealt with post-traumatic stress differently. My one uncle, he had family issues and separation. The other uncle became much more religious. But both coming out of the stressful situation, being in Vietnam, and then being in law enforcement, I had an observation of post-traumatic stress. But then reflecting my own perspective, I worked in the district attorney's office here in Philadelphia and also in the AG's office in Delaware. And the whole concept of being desensitized to trauma as a coping mechanism, didn't really reflect on that until after leaving the office, when you start to look at things like, well, this is just an aggravated assault. It's not an attempted murder, because you deal with certain coping mechanisms. And though for the individual victim, an aggravated assault is defined as serious bodily injury, but when you deal with so many different criminal incidents on a regular basis, you tend to start to become desensitized to some and prioritize others. Whereas an attempted murder, that's ranked in a higher perspective because of the actual crime perspective. But an aggravated assault or a domestic violence situation, because those happen on they're sometimes a lesser charge and have a different perspective, you start to become desensitized. And so as I first got exposed to this concept of secondary trauma, it made me start to reflect on my experience in the DA's office, and also just seeing others and how they dealt with and how they cope on these issues. And I think one of the concerns, and I kind of heard some of this in the commentary from all the panelists, is that we have a cultural perspective, that you would not be in this position, you would have not chose this profession if you just didn't have the ability to cope with it, or, for lack of a better word, suck it up and just deal with it. And I think that's something that we have to change that perspective. I had made a note earlier about employee assistance programs, and I think that's it's a vehicle that's there, but I think people are not necessarily comfortable in using that, because then you're acknowledging to others that you can't deal with this situation, and that may have some impact on their future career growth. regardless if that information is confidential or not. There's a perception. And so I'm curious from the panel in reference to, one, if we can get some more information on the Take Care PHL initiative. Two, how do we try to change the culture to make people, well, one, having a conversation is one way, but two, letting people who are dealing with secondary trauma really have an understanding and belief that you should get some assistance if you're having a challenge, and this will not have a negative impact on your career, but will help you as an individual to have a longer sustaining life. And then three, in reference to what type of resources should we be identifying, especially as we go into next year's budget season from the city perspective.
So I'd like to share that the Take Care PHL initiative was born out of the Philadelphia ACE Task Force Policy and Advocacy Work Group, where we decided to dedicate our resources to really expanding awareness about the impact of secondary traumatic stress. We really wanted the council and the city at large to really understand the impact that secondary traumatic stress has really on the daily lives of first responders, mental health workers, teachers, police enforcement. So the initiative was really to raise awareness about the impact. And we're hoping that out of this awareness that we can create resiliency programs and really kind of have models of care that are really trauma-informed and serve all members, all employees of city organizations. I think that we are looking not to target specific individuals who have to seek assistance in the same way as an employee assistance program would be, but something that is across the board for all employees.
If you could provide that information to the committee so that way we can circulate that information to other council members, because I think that type of initiative is important so we can use that as a means of getting the word out, either through various council offices, through their social media or other means of communication, trying to get the word out and spread the word about some of the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
To the culture issue, I work at the level of organizational culture, and I think if you get enough organizations in our we then affect the larger culture. Since you brought it up, and we're in the budgeting cycle, I've been working with a committee from all of the courts in Philadelphia around. Because when you think about what all of the workers in the courts, not just the judges, but all of the attorneys and also all of the court officials, they are hearing horrible stories, as are the juries. So when we talk about the court system and we think about how do we make that culture trauma informed, so that's what we're working on in this committee, and to go forward, we want to create a whole online course because it's so hard logistically to figure out how do you train 2,500 people that are part of the court system. So that's what we're working on, and going forward, we need some support for creating that online course. And that's an example, I think, of how you start changing a culture. You got to see where the culture is, respect what their limitations and constraints are, but begin by educating everybody about all of this information, which is now really accessible, and it changes people's attitudes, which is critical, and that's what changes behavior.
You know, I forgot to mention, just last night I was having dinner with a DEA agent who was there for 25 years, who lost his son this year to an overdose of opioids. So, you know, this is a real issue of both trauma and vicarious trauma. But let me just say that one of the things that we are working on at the Attorney General's office and on the state level is creating a statewide initiative to provide an awareness about trauma, about the way to respond to trauma, to heal from trauma, and to better understand resilience. I'm working coincidentally with Dr. Bloom and an organization called Lakeside in North Wales. The object of this is to train people across systems, so including law enforcement, first responders, people in government like Dr. Bloom is doing with the judiciary, people in the healthcare world. Many people know about trauma and trauma-informed care, but many people do not, especially doctors. We're talking about reaching out to, working with veterans, although there's a lot of work already being done on that. We're talking also about working with the faith-based community and educators. The bottom line is that we want to have people to have the same understanding of what trauma is, what vicarious trauma is, to have a basic understanding at the very least of what adverse childhood experiences are, and to understand how you can actually heal from that. Because so many of our people who are serving the public really don't have the foggiest idea about this. I learned about this 8 years ago because I read an article in the newspaper, but most people in law enforcement have no idea about what we're talking about here. And they need to understand, because I think not only, especially in the law enforcement world and the first responder world, they will be better able to take care of themselves, realizing that it's not a macho thing to not get help. It's not a smart thing to get help, that the stigma is ridiculous. We need to overcome the stigma of mental illness, especially for people who are serving the public and carrying guns and actually are in a position of actually having this tremendous power. And we want to actually be able to better protect the people of Philadelphia by making sure that the people who are serving those people are really as mentally fit and competent as they could possibly be. So this is an ongoing effort. I know that I'm going to be working closely with Philadelphia officials moving forward. I know there's fantastic work going on in many different respects in Philadelphia, and I'm not suggesting that we have a monopoly on this. As a matter of fact, we don't. We just want to convene people and bring people together on this. So we'll be working on this quite a bit going forward.
Just have one last question. How are other cities dealing with secondary trauma?
It's very variable. So from city to city, there are some places in smaller towns and cities that are really grappling with the issue of how do we make our city trauma informed. And there are others where there's nothing happening. So it depends a lot on who the champions are. If there are champions in city government who can really get onto this issue, that's what makes change happen. It's always about leadership. So if there are leaders who take on this issue, then you start to see change. And it has a lot to do with the ability to bring people together, pool information, pool knowledge, and then really set about policy change. And it's extremely variable. There's no one city that you can say, well, that's the standard. There are different pieces. Everybody's got a different piece of the pie. But we have an opportunity, I think, in Philadelphia to actually really become a trauma-informed city.
If I might just add, so as part of this statewide effort, I've been traveling around the state a lot. And again, it is variable, but there are the good news in what I would perceive to be dark times is that there are amazing human beings, amazing people across the state in lots of places you would never imagine. I mean, for whatever reason, I mean, I shouldn't say it, but the reality is there are amazing people who are working on this issue, excited about this issue, and we're in the process of creating county coalitions, pilot coalitions, to work with us on this. So places like Erie, Pennsylvania, I had no idea would be interested in issues of trauma, but they really are. And they're like Pottstown in Montgomery County. Allegheny County in Pittsburgh has a lot of great stuff. Lancaster County has a lot of great stuff. I was just at a meeting in Bethlehem. They're doing a lot of things. Williamsport. So there is a lot going on, but there is so much we need to do.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll bring up our second panel. We'll have Fred Wright, as well as Dr. Tamara Williams, Phil Demara, Gary Williams, and Barbara Radke. And if you could testify in that order.
Good morning, Councilman Green, Councilwoman Blackwell. How are you doing this morning? My name is Frederick Wright. I'm president of ASME, American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, District Capital 47. We represent employees of the City of Philadelphia, professional and technical employees, Philadelphia Parking Authority, Philadelphia Housing Authority, and First Judicial District. I wish to share with you my concerns and concerns of my sister and brother about the secondary trauma we feel the city needs to do more to protect workers facing this reality on the job. The city has an employee assistance program that many do not take advantage of because you must access it on your own time. This program could be of some assistance in dealing with emotional and behavioral challenges facing our workers. Meanwhile, we have families that require our time and attention. Let me share a few of those stories that elucidate the challenges that we face on the job related to secondary trauma. There was a story of an experience where a person committed suicide by jumping off a top tier wire prison at CFCS. I believe that getting a few days off after witnessing this event would have been helpful. We are not robots, and while our function for inmate safety and security, when these type of things occur, I believe that there should be something in place that would allow us to get some types of counseling during working hours that provided by the other employer. This would assist a worker in processing this experience and be a positive mental health solution that would aid the employer in having a more productive worker. Identifying the weaknesses and building on the strengths of an individual is a key mental health tool for dealing with a variety of the emotional and behavior-related challenges. Workers at DHS share stories about their experience dealing with home visits. They find cases of child abuse and must remove children from their homes. This impacts them after the experience. Years and years of encountering these type of issues have impact, especially when you have a hard time placing children. Also, you see the effects of these experiences on children and sometimes resulting in children with delinquent behavior. Parole officers encountering people that do harm to others. One officer shared a story about their reaction after a dead body of a person was found in the alley, that they had been assaulted and killed by a parolee under their care that was a rapist. Some question arose for the officer about what could have been done to prevent that person and people like that from being on the street and getting involved in abusive behavior and other criminal activities. These are issues that over time weigh on a worker's mindset and I believe should be addressed by some form of counseling. Assistance provided by the employer in the form of counseling, I believe, would aid the mental health of our brothers and sisters in the workforce. Former Mayor Street had a person play a role in establishing more exercise opportunities for city workers. I believe that there should be more mental health counseling opportunities made available during the work hours. Good mental health is at the least as important as our physical health. Thank you for holding this hearing, sponsoring legislation, and providing an opportunity for me to share my concerns and the concerns of our members on the very important matter of secondary trauma and what should be done to assist workers impacted by this on the job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Derek Green and Councilwoman Blackwell, and members of the Committee on the Disabled and Persons with Special Needs. I'm Dr. Tamara Williams. I'm the Deputy Chief Clinical Officer at Community Behavioral Health, a division of the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, or DBHIDS. Thank you for this opportunity to testify in response to Resolution 180041. The mission of DBHIDS is to educate, strengthen, and serve individuals and communities so that all Philadelphians can thrive. But this education, strengthening, and service goes beyond the traditional mental health and substance abuse services that are commonly associated with our department. As DBHIDS focuses on population health and building community resilience, our concerns include not just those who have a diagnosis, but to the health of all people in Philadelphia. This is especially important as we talk today about secondary traumatic stress, or STS, and staff resiliency programs for professional caregivers. We all know and experience and hear about the stresses and traumas experienced daily by the residents of Philadelphia. And these experiences, as expanded upon by the work of the ACEs task force and summarized in the ACEs study, show that as we are exposed to adverse experiences in our youth and throughout our lives, the accumulation of those stresses and traumas can have significant negative impacts on our relationships, our well-being, and our health, both mental and physical. In response to this, the city and its departments, particularly those in the Human Services Cabinet, so DBH, IDS, DHS, PDPH, OHS, as well as our first responders, so the police department, the fire department, EMS, and PGW, licensing and inspection, 311, and other outward-facing departments, as well as our vast provider networks, have developed and provided services to those seeking assistance and support for a wide variety of issues, in many cases incorporating trauma-informed approaches. While our staff and departments work tirelessly to support the residents of Philadelphia, they often experience firsthand or hear the stories of those experiences. So it's the poverty, the food and housing insecurity, the violence, whether it be community, personal, or interpersonal, the illnesses, and the struggles that Philadelphians overcome daily. Our staff also live and work in these same communities and may themselves directly experience these traumatic stressors, either in their personal or their professional lives. Hearing these stories can and does lead to the experience of secondary traumatic stress, which the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN, defines as the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. The essential act of listening to trauma stories may take an emotional toll that compromises professional functioning and diminishes quality of life. So without putting too fine of a point on it or getting lost in some of the semantics, essentially anytime someone experiences a traumatic incident or helps someone deal with a traumatic incident, that can help expose the helper to secondary traumatic stress. So traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress has been receiving newfound attention as we focus on trauma more broadly and the experience of so many of our returning service people. The experience of these stressors can include feelings of isolation, anxiety, some of the detachment that you mentioned, physical ailments, sleep disturbances, increased risk of suicide, and decreased job performance. And research shows us that there are professions where the rates of PTSD are highest, and not surprisingly, those include the military, police, fire, EMS, and also healthcare workers who may experience traumatic stress and are also susceptible to STS. Professions at risk for secondary traumatic stress typically include trauma therapists, social workers, child protective service workers, as well as teachers, among others. And STS is associated with a high prevalence of job burnout across various occupational groups, reaching up to 67% in the community of mental health workers. PTSD and other illnesses, for example, depression, contribute significantly to the increased rates of disability, healthcare utilization, and spending, as well as days of work loss. And we can begin to address this known problem by creating an environment of awareness, support, and tolerance. As a city, we have a duty of care to our employees and workers by helping them to navigate these experiences and offering and encouraging the utilization of supports. So the question is, who helps the helpers? In terms of support for workers, we know that secondary traumatic stress is real. We know they can have a significant impact on our health and overall functioning. We also know that protective factors, such as quality of trauma training, perceived stress levels of work, wellness, and a functional structured work environment have been identified as protective factors. So what can we do? There are a few things that we can do to help. One is to raise awareness. As part of any comprehensive approach to a problem, we need to acknowledge and talk about secondary traumatic stress. The opportunity to learn about STS, as well as resilience building and self-care, should be afforded to all staff. It's about education and knowing the signs. Provide good supervision is also another way that we can help. Supervisors should be trained in STS, understand the stressors that staff are exposed to, and be trained to provide leadership, support, and access to resources in a non-judgmental way. Thirdly, we can assist by developing wellness programs. So staff who have access to wellness programs that are staff developed, staff led, and meet their identified needs have been demonstrated to improve morale, decrease lost work time, improve work outcomes, and lead to improved health and feelings of well-being. And then lastly, we can offer resources. Employees should be educated about their EAP, and the services provided by the EAP should be robust and extensive to meet the variety of needs that may arise from the experience of STS. In addition, information about community-based resources should be disseminated regularly, and utilization of those resources encouraged. So again, I would just like to thank the City Council for raising the awareness about this often overlooked aspect of providing human services, and also for showing a willingness to stand up for and protect professional and personal caregivers, and for giving me the opportunity to provide the testimony. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning to Councilwoman Blackwell and Councilmember Green. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Gary Williams, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer for DHS University at the Department of DHS. Again, thank you for this great opportunity to present testimony. Our Commissioner Cynthia Figueroa unfortunately was not able to attend today. However, she has allowed me to present this testimony on her behalf. As a social worker for the City of Philadelphia for over 20 years, I know firsthand the value of supporting caregivers and first responders. For DHS social workers and provider case managers who are on the front lines every day, it has significance. While they work hard every day to keep kids safe, they themselves can experience secondary trauma. Witnessing the impact of abuse and neglect on children stays in one's heart forever. DHS experiences families at their most critical, vulnerable moments. We see children whose lives have been forever altered by trauma. The very nature of this work can have a tremendous effect on child welfare workers, impacting both them professionally as well as personally. The link between secondary stress syndrome and child welfare workers is well documented. At DHS, we find ways to help staff get the help they need to address the impact of trauma on their own lives, and to look systemically at how we can mitigate secondary stress for child welfare workers. For example, we encourage our staff to practice self-care by providing, at no cost to the employee, external support for trauma and grief. We also have worked hard to maintain lower case ratios and now have one of the lowest in the state. In order to support the complex and challenging role of child welfare social workers, we have also enhanced partnerships with providers and other city systems so that they can help families get timely access to services such as behavioral health, free legal support, and housing, just to name a few. Another system approach we have recently begun to use is reviewing the science of safety and how other industries approach emergency situations. This is providing a different lens for us to evaluate system responses to the ever-present stressors of being a child welfare social worker. Again, thank you for the opportunity to provide a short testimony this morning on behalf of the Philadelphia Department of Human Services. Forums like this that recognizes the physical and emotional toll of working with and taking care of people who are affected by trauma is critical to further our understanding and support of important roles we all have and the work we must do together to address the impact of secondary trauma. And if I may, I want to just take one moment just to highlight a very important partnership that we have at the Department of Human Services with the Ladipo Group. In 2015, we engaged in this partnership with this minority certified business, and their expertise is really trauma-informed services. They provide professional development training as it relates to secondary trauma, psychoeducational group work, as well as individual counseling and therapy for our staff. Again, this is an independent entity that has come alongside of DHS that our social workers can access without management and can access anonymously in the event that and when instances call for trauma response, debriefing, counseling, etc. Really excited about that particular partnership, and certainly could build upon that as a model for the city. Thank you again, and certainly happy to be here with you.
Thank you. We're going to ask a few questions in this panel, then we'll have the other people come up to.
I'm the fourth person on this panel. I'm just sitting back here.
Right. We're going to ask a few questions to this group, and then we'll bring you up to the table. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge a colleague that's a member of this committee and vice chair of this committee, Helen. It was actually through her leadership when I first saw the video from Vic Comfort on caregivers when we did a briefing in the caucus room. So I'm going to thank her for being here and thank her for her leadership in initially getting this concept started in City Council regarding secondary trauma. I just want to ask a few questions, and then we'll have other people from this panel testify. Mr. Williams, you talked about the DHS entity. Could you give me a little more background on that entity, how it got started? Because I think as I was listening to Mr. Wright from DC 47 about the need for counseling, and also I heard about wellness from Dr. Williams. I want to get some perspective on that because I was thinking there needs to be some entity beyond just EAP where people could feel comfortable and come into an environment, and it sounds like DHS is doing that. There could be something that could be used in other areas, other jurisdictions for first responders and others. So I'm curious about the background of that organization.
Absolutely. Again, in 2015, the department acknowledged the impact of secondary stress, vicarious trauma. And specifically, this conversation started within our Act 33 table, whereby our social workers are being exposed to very difficult situations, let me just say. So we're talking about child fatality, near fatality. So the leadership at that time committed to actually establishing intervention outside of the department. To your earlier point, Councilman Green, we wanted to make sure that the management and the hierarchical of the organization did not impede anyone's willingness to access intervention. So the conversation led to a development of a process whereby the Ladipo group actually can be accessed outside of management and leadership at the department. And so sometimes we actually, based on what's happening, we've brought them in to do psychoeducational group. It could be, as I said earlier, it could be a result of a child dying or a colleague dying, where we can actually bring folks in and they can do some intervention on the ground. And then beyond that, the individual social worker who elects to access that service could do so on their own accord. They will actually receive up to 3 individual sessions along with referral linkages if need be. So it is an effort to actually make things available for our staff, understanding the very difficult work that they do. And again, this is completely anonymous and separate from leadership at the department.
So this is a subcontract that DHS has with a private organization that provides these services that you inform employ the DHS that they can access in addition to EAP?
Yes, that is correct.
Gotcha, okay.
That is correct.
Mr. Wright, you talked earlier about, in your testimony, about the need for counseling. And is that something you also see that's needed separate and apart than any type of EAP assistance?
Oh, definitely. As a union, we have EAP service for our members, but specifically what we're talking about is something during the work day that you don't have to access on your own personal time. The way I understand it now, employees who need this kind of counseling have to get that on their own personal time that they really need to spend with their families and stuff. So in my testimony, I said that need to be during the work day.
Okay. And then finally, for Dr. Williams, you talked about this concept of duty of care and also the whole concept of getting people more familiar with the whole concept of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. And I reflect on the fact that, when my father was in the Korean conflict, now say Korean War, you didn't really hear about post-traumatic stress at that time period. Coming out of Vietnam, and I make references to my uncles who were both in Vietnam, who were both in law enforcement, it was those veterans that you started to first really hear about post-traumatic stress. And then there was a number of, arts and cultural perspectives from movies and documentaries and literature that talked more and more about post-traumatic stress, and now that's something that's much more well-known. And then coming out of the conflicts we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq, there's something that's much part of everyone's nomenclature in reference to the challenges when people return from military service. From that same perspective, I think that's something that's also needed in regard to this concept of secondary trauma, because it's something that a number of people are dealing with, but it's not talked about in a part of everyday lingo or perspective. And you made reference to also the concept of duty of care, which is, as an attorney, is something that I'm familiar with, that we do have a duty of care to our employees, those who work with us as part of our city. One last question and point, I'm curious from the perspective of cost. You made reference to some of the financial impacts of secondary trauma, but I don't know that's really articulated that the impact that we have from a budgetary perspective on people who are calling out sick more frequently, other challenges not being as productive in the workday. Can you provide any information about some of the financial impact of not dealing with secondary trauma? Because I think doing some of the things we talked about, from what Mr. Wright talked about, opportunities for people to have counseling as part of their workday. Mr. Williams talked about providing additional programs and opportunities that are contracted for nonprofits, as well as using other means of informing city employees about these resources. There's a financial impact to that, but there's also a financial impact of not doing that. And so if you could speak to that at all.
Yes, there are some studies which I could provide you at another time to reference, but for example, there was some research done in Australia around the impact of not providing some of the services and trauma-informed workplace in various work settings, and they really framed it in terms of a return on investment. And so they were able to come up with a dollar amount, which I don't have with me, but they were able to put a dollar amount on how much money is saved by an organization when they invest in providing care for their employees and making sure that they have resources that they are able to address any secondary traumatic stress symptoms so that they're able to return to work and be productive at work. And that's something that I'd be happy to provide you in terms of a resource.
Yes, if you could provide that to the committee, we can circulate to committee members. Last point, we just went through our open enrollment process here in the city of Philadelphia. If you go back 10 years ago, the focus of wellness was not as, was talked about in a macro way, but not as a finite perspective. And I think that's coming from health insurance companies realizing the cost impact of not having employees who are eating right, not having insured members who are eating right or participating in athletic activities, not doing smoking or reducing the alcohol intake and those type of things. So those are things that the health insurance companies are doing. But as part of that whole wellness concept, there's a brief discussion about EAP, but it's not incentivized or not discussed in a more robust way like some of these other things. And from my perspective, a person cannot be fully well if they are physically well but not mentally well. And I think that's something that we need to find a way as we talk about these wellness perspectives that we do every year, and we talk about, okay, many of us have some type of tracker on their wrist or some other means of trying to count how many steps they're doing a day and how much intake they're taking in reference to salts or sugars and how much water they're drinking. But we're not talking about the other aspect, which is the brain, which is to me probably the most important muscle in the body, and how we deal with those type of issues. So that's something I think we can also start to find a way of getting into the conversation of wellness. Because it's talked about a little bit, but a more vital aspect of wellness for employees.
That's a very good point. I would agree. There are lots of financial incentives to take care of your physical health, but you don't often find the same financial incentives to take care of your mental health.
Okay. All right. Councilwoman again.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here, and my apologies for being a little bit late, but this is a really important issue for me, and I really appreciate all the work that all of you have done. Had a chance to preview your testimony before. I just had to refresh my memory because it was a busy day yesterday. But, a couple of the questions I know that have come out for me is that, we've been following your work, obviously, but, we're trying to talk about what it looks like in schools. So we doubled the number of social workers in schools this year, but we also changed up the program so that it's not just someone who is meant to serve individual students, but tries to look at the whole school. And it's in part because we've dealt with so much secondary trauma with teachers and educators in schools dealing with short staffs. We had a nurse or a counselor quit because there was no nurse on duty, and a police officer who had broken up a fight had a heart attack in a bathroom, and she was the one who was trying to help. And so, these kinds of issues have profound impact. She ended up leaving her position and, had been at the school for a really long time. So this is very, very deeply important and meaningful. I guess my question has a lot to do with whether you feel like there are I know that there are offerings, but sometimes what employees, obviously, who suffer secondary trauma don't realize is that they're going through it. And so have you worked on recommendations on how, we as a city can be much more proactive about reaching out to employees, doing a check-in? I don't know how it works with especially high-impact fields like public safety, but also, really President Wright, your team, and all the things that they deal with as social workers in the city, how you see a proactive agenda moving through and what the city should be paying attention to.
One of the things that we've done at DHS is actually through this partnership with the Ladipo Group, was actually made training available. I think part of it is really educating and increasing the awareness of your staff. So we've had opportunities to actually provide this level of training, specifically with vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, to our staff, new hires, as well as existing staff. That is a beginning. I think an informational campaign, training campaign to really educate folks in the field, in various fields, as to the implications of secondary trauma is a big first step. And not to suggest that we're doing all the right things, but I think partnerships with folks who really know what they're doing with this particular topic, cultivating those relationships and developing convenings where we can get messages out to staff and the general public. The other thing we've tried to do at DHS, we are one of the leading agencies that provide mental health first aid training. So that is also a requirement that all of our new hires actually receive. And that's simply really identifying when someone is in a distressful situation and what to do about that. Again, not to suggest that we're doing all of the right things, but I think we are making some strides in the direction. But to answer your question directly, I think a big first step is increasing awareness of an internal staff and even how we promote our services.
Councilwoman Jim, how you doing today?
Good morning.
Clearly, from our aspect, labor, the city can do more, a lot more.
Yeah.
And just let me elaborate a little bit. In these PATH negotiations that we just went through in the spring of this year, we had to really negotiate and strive that the city recognize psychological injuries as part of a workplace injury type of thing. Before that, the city wouldn't even recognize psychological injuries in our field. They did that for the police, they did it for fire, they didn't do that for, I remember, DC 47. We believe that, when there's, especially at DHS, when there's an injury, that a secondary injury, that impacts not only the person, but the whole unit that they're working with. So again, there needs to be outreach, proactive outreach to people in that unit, to make that counseling available to them, because again, most DHS workers are dedicated people. They have caseloads that they're trying to meet. They have families they're trying to protect. And we believe there needs to be more of a proactive approach into getting training to them and the resources they need to cope with what they're dealing with every day.
And so could you repeat, just for clarity, police and fire recognize psychological injury
Yes.
as a
For IOP, right,
For-
injured on duty.
right,
And we
as
just,
a physical
right, and
injury?
we just got that this year in our contract.
Okay, I wanted to make sure. So you do now recognize
Yes.
that
Well, the
within
city
your contract?
recognized it for us, yes.
Yes, okay, because that was very important
Yes.
to understand, because I think that is part of one of the questions I have. I think we can, part of the issue that I think has been raised with a lot of professionals in the area, and even because you are the professional in the area, with DC 47 and your team, as well as DHS, is that we can still do the training, we can still be hyper aware, but the surprising thing is that people still don't respond until we are proactively reached out to, and someone takes a moment to say, "You're not looking well, could I help? Is there anything you need, or tell me what's going on?" And, I think we all are working on that, speaking from personal experience, and how to be a little bit more thoughtful. And the realization is that in the kind of madhouse world that we're in, where people feel like they have to constantly deliver, or we deal with individuals who may be extremely high achieving and don't often want to talk about their struggles, or give the implication that they can't perform at, like 2,000% every single day of their life. It takes a proactive effort, and I don't know, I would know that for me personally, being on city council, I don't feel like I've personally had that training about how to proactively do that, but I think we get a lot of training, like there is secondary traumatic stress. This is what it kind of looks like. But when you're dealing with people that you see every single day, we still don't see it, and we still don't make time for it. So I guess that's what I'm asking about. Are there recommendations? And I know, President Wright, if you feel like what worked through during your recent contract negotiations, whether by recognizing psychological injury as being a very real aspect as equal to physical injury, whether that affords you particular access to resources, experiences, or trainings, or behavioral changes for management that could inform us on how to do things better.
Well, because we saw that as a very important benefit, because now this is recognized by the city as a psychological injury, that now our members are afforded time off. Injured on duty, so they afforded time off and everything that associated with it. It's just like they was a physical injury, that they have the time they need to recoup mentally so they can get right back in the mindset to get back on the job. Before, again, that wasn't recognized, but they couldn't take time off from work with that sort of injury.
Great. And are there any other recommendations that you would have for us as well, President Wright?
Again, just that we believe the city should be more proactive, just like they did with the physical fitness type thing on the John Street, where he dedicated a person to communicate to the city employees they need to be more fit, eat right, and everything like that. We believe the city should take the same aspect as far as the mental aspect of employees working on the job.
Thank you. Mr. Williams?
Oh, yeah. I would also like to say that part of the way that we can be proactive is what was mentioned by the previous panel, is implementing trauma-informed workplace. So whether it's the sanctuary model or risking connections, I think that helps to build a vernacular and a language within the workplace so that there's more openness around discussing secondary traumatic stress. I know that my colleague Phil DeMara will also be able to share some additional resources when he is up to speak as well.
Thank you.
And Councilman, again, I just wanted to also mention, also highlight, I alluded to this in my testimony, but the Department of Human Services, we also are beginning to look at how to effectively cultivate a safety culture. So this whole concept of a safety culture comes out of different industries, health industries, aviation, and we actually, this few weeks ago, we had a national expert that came to present this concept to our staff at large. And underneath the safety culture is really creating a work environment that's conducive to the well-being of your staff. You know, it's really about system accountability. And the way that we are approaching this is really focusing on leadership and also the supervisory responsibility of our staff. So, because if we can educate the supervisors and managers as to how to detect when someone is in crisis, I think that's another important step. I'm not suggesting that it's no one strategy that's going to work. I think all of what we are talking about has to kind of work together to really be more trauma informed and really be responsive to our staff. So just wanted to make that mention.
Thank you very much.
We'll now have the second part of this panel. If people can come up to the table. Thank you for your testimony. And we'll have Barbara Racky, and Phil DeMara.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity very much. And Helen, I can't, Councilwoman Gim, I can't not say congratulations for a great day yesterday for the city of Philadelphia. I'm the director of Philipposh, the Philadelphia Area Project on Occupational Safety and Health, which we're in our 43rd year of providing assistance to workers who are injured on the job. But it's been helpful to hear the other testimony because I want to just comment on some things that I don't think have been covered to sort of fill in based on our experience. Many public workers in Philadelphia also have to respond to catastrophic incidents. And one incident I remember was that when there had been a gas explosion and the gas workers had to respond, and one of those responders was a young 19-year-old gas employee. His name was Mark Keeley. And I didn't realize that gas employees, unlike firefighters, do not have beepers on them. So if in fact they're lost at a catastrophic scene, they have to be physically found. There's no way to find them. And Mark died that day in responding to that gas explosion. His father also worked for the gas company. And we did a lot of follow-up with them, and the trauma that was experienced by all the gas workers who participated in the response to that explosion and participated in searching for Mark Keeley when his body could not be found at that explosion site in Philadelphia, the suffering his father went through. That happens over and over again. Sadly, city employees do get killed on the job. We saw it in the school district when a boiler exploded and all the workers who were at the school that day suffered a trauma that some of them still have not recovered from due to the grief of going through it. A worker was killed at Fleet Management. We interact with the families, with the children, with the spouses, but I've always wondered if there was a city response in terms of pulling together the people they worked with, the people were impacted by that loss, by the trauma that experienced that loss. it appears to me that probably way more could be done in responding to that. And also the families who suffer debilitating grief as a result of that stress. And again, it's not clear to me that oftentimes worker compensation really does not look at that aspect. Another example is calls we've taken from workers who've been out on long-term injury that they've suffered at work, and over time it begins to have impact on their family. And I have taken calls, because we get calls from injured workers, from fathers who have told me on the phone they're ready to commit suicide because they've had to pull their child from college. They've lost all their health insurance, and they really don't know which way to turn. So I think whether it's a fatal workplace catastrophe or just long-term injuries, there is a traumatic event that happens and can create a lot of stress. Also, we're recognizing that workplace violence is increasingly creating traumatic responses for impact on workers who are experiencing it. I work in the AFSCME District our office is in AFSCME District Council 33, and the parking authority, the union that represents the parking authority workers, is there, and increasingly they'll come and talk to us about the impact of being threatened by people they're giving tickets to on the street, and that continues to happen over and over and over. I know that in the social service world for workers, some of the non-professional staff, the support staff that are in those offices that are frequently threatened by the public coming into those offices. And over time, that kind of fear that it starts getting associated with just going to work every day and wondering what can happen is something that probably hasn't gotten enough attention. And certainly it could be identified in terms of the kind of work situations where the non-professional staff are also exposed to very stressful situations. I think I don't want to repeat what other people have covered so thoroughly. I think this was an area that hadn't been covered, and I wanted to be sure it was brought to your attention.
Good morning, Councilman Green, Councilwoman Gim. My name is Phil DeMara. I'm the Director of Trauma and Crisis Services for the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. I'm also the Director of Emergency Preparedness and Response. So to my co-panelists, a number of those critical acute incidents, we often get the call to respond to those, whether they be things happening in the community or whether they be things happening to other city departments. I'm also not going to repeat what other panelists have said, but to just echo some of the comments that were made earlier. Educating people, whether it's staff, caregivers, families around the city, is incredibly important to begin to address this issue. But it's also not talking in the language that we've been talking here about this. When we talk about trauma, when we talk about traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress, people often don't make that connection with themselves and what their physical experience is or what's happening to them. So figuring out how do we make that information itself accessible to people? How do we get them to understand that shared experience and then know where to go to get those resources is incredibly important. For whether it be the school district, whether it be city agencies or city organizations, leadership has a huge piece of this, and also first responders. When there's a culture of we can do this, this is what we're trained in, it's, this is no problem for us. I come from a law enforcement family, a military family, and that sort of attitude pervades a lot of what we do until leadership begins to speak about these secondary traumatic stress issues, encouraging people to access services. It's going to continue to be difficult to get people to those services. One of the things from an acute perspective, when we do respond, we're often sent out to do something. And what that something is never very clearly defined. And so what we've been doing in some recent programming, our Network of Neighbors Trauma Response Program in particular, is really working with communities and groups in advance so that they know about our resources and then can invite us in, so that we're asked to provide support rather than forcing that support on people who may not be able to or understand why, or maybe we're outsiders and they don't know us, and so it's harder to accept that. So making a lot of that information available ahead of time, and I think we do that through a number of our programs within the department, whether it's our Healthy Minds Philly website, where people can get screenings or can get information about more basic non-diagnostic level issues, whether it's the training we provide in mental health first aid, the training we provide around trauma, self-care, and others through our training and education network, implementing evidence-based practices in our service providers so that when people come to us for treatment, they're actually able to get relief from what's happening. So all of those things, I think, taking it together can improve how people react to the secondary traumatic stress. And the last thing that I'll just say, we've done a number of those we respond a lot to community violence. We respond and coordinate a lot with the school district, and we've worked very hard to not only establish relationships with communities, with advocates, with organizations that work in those areas, but when we respond, it's very often difficult even to get people's time to begin to address the secondary traumatic stress issues. Getting a teacher or teachers freed up for 2 hours to sit down and talk about that experience is often incredibly difficult. But when we go out, they don't want to talk about, or they don't want to receive help around the secondary traumatic stress at that point. What they're more interested in doing is talking about self-care or something a little safer, because they're just not sure what that means to be receiving those types of services. So it is really a layered approach to it. It's educating. It's, as Dr. Williams mentioned, bringing in that vernacular into those areas. When people are able to talk about their experience and recognize what they're going through, it makes it much easier to then be able to seek out those services. And in the years that I've been working in disaster response, in community violence response, with our first responder partners to building collapses or whatever else is going on, the need to wrap these types of services around everyone every time something happens is something I think that's lacking. We do it here and there. I know my department and myself get called very frequently to respond to those, but we need to have better or more dedicated full-time resources that are available to provide that education and to provide that response. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your comments, and also thank you for getting us to think in a broader perspective regarding secondary trauma. Ms. Radke, when you made reference to both the gas explosion with unfortunate passing of Mr. Keeley, being someone that currently chairs the Gas Commission, I've been involved with PGW for some time. I very recognize that impact and the impact it had on members of Local 686 that they're still dealing with. And then when you also made reference to the unfortunate passing of Chris Trackmas, member of SEIU, 32BJ, and the impact that's still having on those employees when that explosion happened in 2016. So, thank you. Councilwoman Gibb.
Yeah, just a quick question. Is the city required to do reviews for its employees? Do you know? Do city departments review employees or offer annual reviews or anything?
Performance reviews? They do performance reviews.
Yeah,
yes.
performance
reviews every year, yes.
And so is that a place where you can kind of insert some level of training for anyone who does a performance review, to use that as an opportunity to ask, to some extent, get people habitually asking certain questions that offer an employee a chance to give feedback, or also, offer resources or advice? Is that something that you already do, or do you think that that's something that you
mean
have
offering
already been involved in significantly?
Advice and questions around secondary traumatic stress? My experience as a supervisor and manager in the city, that's not part of what goes into a performance review. It's pretty strictly focused on, what's the quality of your work, what's the quantity of your work, how are you getting along with folks, how are you performing your duties. I would probably say that I would want to see those questions and discussions happen more frequently than once a year for employees that I'm working with. And so what supervisors could really use is training around exactly what we're talking about today. So if we train supervisors in their weekly or biweekly or monthly supervision to be asking those questions and checking in with people in a different way, not just how are you doing, because we all say fine, but knowing what the signs are when someone is experiencing difficulty. Because when we work in particular fields, we know what the stressors are. We know what some of those stress responses can look like. And so we should be more comfortable asking those questions when we're in those supervisory roles. And then we're then modeling that behavior so that I'm concerned and I'm paying attention to my health. I'm also concerned and paying attention to your health and mental health. And I'm asking you these questions to get you support, not in a punitive way. When things are seen as asking questions that could be loaded or that might impact my future work performance, then you get a lot of resistance to that. But I would much rather have employees who are engaged in getting help, identifying that they need help, getting that help, and then coming back to work than ignoring it completely.
No, I think that's right. I think it would probably be better worked in other places. I'm just trying to figure out like how there are formal processes that might be in place where it's not a threatening kind of situation for individuals to say that they would like to talk through, assistance or help for themselves. But I think that absent those, it ends up being sort of, incidental, casual. It's like, it's off hours. It's not really built into some kind of more formalized process. And I think it's worth, if your department has recommendations on how to do that best, which includes those type of things, like whatever your check-in is, this is an important question to ask everybody. And the way to ask it would be helpful, I think, to me personally, but I would think that, it would be helpful to other city departments.
Yeah, and there are approaches like motivational interviewing that give folks, the supervisors, the skills and how to ask those questions. I think building it into performance review would be an interesting approach, but I also imagine that there would be a big discussion from a legal perspective around introducing behavioral or mental health types of issues into that, as well as discussions with the unions before that would be able to happen. But we'd be more than happy to provide some best practices around that if we're able to find them. Thank you.
Okay, could just add one thought, sort of on the same topic too, from discussions I've been in with city workers where they're very much they're the front line, and they've expressed frustration with having expressed their feeling of anxiety and threat when clients coming in get agitated, they're upset, and the person who's sitting there sort of waiting for them to be able to see, a counselor or someone is the person who's taking the impact of that. And they feel like even offices are not arranged and they talk on deaf ears, so that if someone does begin to attack them for real rather than just threatening to, the office is set up in a way where they have a panic button or they have something. In other words, I hear a lot of frustration that those concerns that workers have just are sort of poo-pooed. They're not taken seriously, and maybe there'd be, and whether their fears are real or not, they feel them, and it's creating a lot of anxiety. So maybe departmental meetings, there might be other formal places where there would be a place for people to express those feelings and offer suggestions of how they feel they could be made safer. But it's something we hear a lot from people. Yeah.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll bring up the next panel. Crystal Yates and Matthew White. And after that panel, we'll have our final panel, which they can come up right after this panel testifies. That'll be Vic Comfort and Betty Lee Davis.
Good morning, Chairman Green and other members of the Committee on Disabled and Persons with Special Needs. My name is Crystal Yates. I'm the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of EMS for the Fire Department, and I'm here on behalf of Fire Commissioner Teal regarding Resolution Number 180041. On behalf of Commissioner Teal, thank you for including the Fire Department in this discussion. Philadelphia's emergency medical services system is one of the busiest systems in the United States, We respond to approximately 900 medical incidents per day. Our paramedics, emergency medical technicians, and firefighters respond to various types of medical incidents. They involve shootings, stabbings, suicides, fire deaths, and injuries to children. The stress associated with responding to traumatic events can have a cumulative effect on first responders. As the number of annual responses increases, Philadelphia's emergency medical services personnel undoubtedly face greater probability of provider fatigue, secondary stress, and burnout. The fire department considers the mental and physical health of our members a priority. Our employee assistant program is available to assist department personnel and their families in overcoming personal and professional problems. Our EAP program provides confidential counseling 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. This past year, each paramedic and emergency medical technician received the pocket-sized Employee Assistant Program Resource Guide. This guide can be used as a tool to increase resilience, learn more about common issues first responders face, and assist with connection to resources. Additionally, all EMS providers have received mental health first aid training, and they are equipped to assist someone experiencing a crisis. As we recognize the impact of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, it is important to encourage awareness in caretakers, first responders, human services professionals, and healthcare providers. In the upcoming months, the fire department will be partnering with the Philadelphia Department of Public Health and the University of Pennsylvania through a grant to implement resiliency training. We will first be focusing on providing the training to our 4 full-time EAP staff and the 13 active backup counselors. We will also include our 4 external partner organizations that provide emotional and psychological support to the members of the fire department workforce. These organizations will be invited to provide 2 participants to receive the Resiliency Train the Trainer program. I would like to thank City Council for raising awareness about the cumulative stress associated with the work we do as first responders and for giving me the opportunity to provide short testimony. This concludes my testimony. I welcome questions.
Good morning, Chairman Green, Councilmember Gibb. My name is Matthew White. I'm here on behalf of Police Commissioner Ross in response to this resolution. On behalf of the Commissioner, thank you for allowing the Police Department to be included in the discussion. The Police Department is aware of secondary traumatic stress, also known as compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. This can be the cumulative effect on first responders, emergency medical technicians, therapists, and doctors who are overexposed to the trauma experienced by others. This can result in lower self-esteem, apathy, poor concentration, negativity, irritability, anxiety, and lapses in empathy. The police department cares greatly about the health and welfare of our officers and has implemented some of the best services available through our employee assistance program and our relationship with Penn Behavioral Health. The employee assistance program, its mission is to assist department personnel and their families in overcoming personal and professional problems. The unit provides peer counseling and support services by making assessments and providing referral services. Services are confidential and provided by sworn members of the department. They're available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Referrals to EAP may be made by the employee themselves through a self-referral, by their supervisor through a supervisory referral, or mandated by policy, a departmental referral. The department also contracts with Penn Behavioral Health to provide external EAP services. PBH provides 3 free sessions to department members and their families with a licensed counselor. They also staff a telephone line to respond to calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Department members may also obtain mental health treatment through their medical coverage. Providers range from licensed counselors, psychiatrists, and psychologists, depending upon the employee's needs. Treatment through medical coverage may be obtained initially by the employee or via referral from EAP or Penn Behavioral Health, based on the employee's needs. In 2017, our EAP members and Penn Behavioral Health actually conducted roll call trainings to ensure personnel are aware of the services and know how to obtain them. Happy to say that during that period, utilization rates of both services increased. Also, EAP members have conducted follow-up calls and roll call visits for personnel involved in sensitive assignments, such as the injury or death of a child or lost departmental personnel. EAP responds to all police-involved firearm discharges resulting in injury from the discharge, all incidents in which a member of the department is shot, incidents involving the sudden death of a department member or close relative, and requests from departmental personnel. Again, thank you for the time and the ability to contribute. This concludes my testimony, and I remain happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you for your testimony. Sergeant White, I was informed that you attended the renowned university on North Broad Street for law school, that being Temple Law School like myself, and my legislative director, Frank Inuzzi. So it's good to have you here. And also, Ms. Yates, thank you for your service as well. One of the things I wanted to touch base on, and we talked a little bit earlier about the whole culture, which I think is even more challenging in the uniform services, both from police and fire perspective, of not be willing to talk about the fact that you're dealing with some of these issues. You talked about roll call as a way of communicating, and that's something I wasn't aware that through roll call there's providing an opportunity to inform people about the opportunity for additional services to help deal with some of the secondary trauma that the officers are dealing with. And I'm curious from the fire department perspective, they have a similar perspective or means of getting information out to officers, and also how do we try to change the perspective and the culture to let people know that if you're dealing with some issues, it's okay to ask for assistance.
So from the police department, I think the culture is there, and that people are more willing to accept services than perhaps outsiders recognize. That being said, we do provide, I think I touched on multiple ways in which someone can be referred, either themselves or being noticed by a supervisor, or some ways that are controlled by policy, where if you're involved in certain types of incidents, you will go to EAP. We make different levels of service available. The department member counseling through AP, also higher degrees of professional service. So, but I do believe that the department members are aware and willing to seek help as needed.
And I would agree with that. The fire department, we don't do a daily roll call, even though it is in our directives to do that. We have what's called a kitchen table culture.
Right.
So we do enjoy meals together, and that's an opportunity for the supervisor to lay eyes on all of his or her members, and they can recognize the signs and symptoms of stress. The other thing we do is we have a closed-circuit television station for fire department members only. We do post messages on that television station regularly when we want to get words out to our members. And culture in the fire department, we recognize that some people are more comfortable seeking help through their member organization. So our labor union has a peer support program. They make routine visits to the fire stations. We have an African American group, a Hispanic group, and we have a group that focuses on women, and they all will be provided with the resiliency training, and they all have access to peer support as well.
That's good to hear that that type of assistance is provided. And it sounds like the organizing units for both the fire department as well as the Valiants in Local 22, and then I'm assuming that in the police department, FOP Local 5 also provides similar opportunity to provide those type of assistance for uniform members. Do you see any need, or you may have heard earlier the concept that DHS has with this pilot, where they have a subcontract with a nonprofit that provides that type of assistance kind of off-site? Is that something that you think may be beneficial? And that that's already occurring probably maybe through the locals, but is that something that could be an opportunity for officers to participate in that gives them that ability to be in a more peer-oriented perspective? You talked about peer group, but is that something that the city should offer, or should we continue to support what's already being done by organized labor?
So for the fire department, we do offer outside counseling services. Our EAP staff know their limitations, and they have access to professional counselors and therapists. One thing that I think I would be proud to speak about, one of our retirees is a PhD psychologist. So she frequently is reached out to interact with our members because she understands our unique circumstances. So she's used a lot by the peer program as well as EAP. So I think that what we have going there really does work. And with the addition of the Penn resiliency training, I think the support is there. Thank you.
From the police department standpoint, I'm proud of both our internal EAP and the Penn Behavioral Health support that we receive. I think they do an excellent job. That being said, I'm never opposed to hearing about other options. Just because something's done well doesn't mean that you can't explore a way to do better.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We'll bring up and also thank you for your service as well. We'll bring up the final panel, Betty Lee Davis, Vic Comfer, and Leslie Lieberman.
I was going to say good morning, Philadelphia City Council, but I think now I'll say good afternoon.
Yes.
Philadelphia City Council. Thank you, Philadelphia City Council, with special appreciation to Council members Green and Jim as sponsors for holding today's hearings about secondary traumatic stress as a workplace hazard for Philadelphia's professional caregivers and first responders, and to learn about resiliency programs. I'm Dr. Betty Lee Davis. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm honored to be here. As a member of the Caregivers Film Advisory Group, I joined the Philadelphia ACE Task Force Advisory and Policy Work Group, which brings me here today. Before beginning my testimony, I would like to note that I've not made a practice of wearing hats, indoors or out, but I'm wearing one today, not to make a statement as a working woman, as those of you of a certain era will know that Bella Abzug did, but to protect my scalp as it heals from a medical procedure. And doing so, I joined Bella Abzug in the spirit of activism, not as a working woman, but as a woman working to protect workers from secondary trauma or traumatic stress in the workplace. As our committee set about its task preparing for these hearings, we considered ways that we might achieve our goal of protecting Philadelphia workers from workplace secondary traumatic stress. Given the volume and variety of workplaces, that was a formidable task. As we considered the myriad of possibilities, the light went on for me. OSHA. That's the job of OSHA, to protect workers from workplace hazards. My task for the group then became learning how to get OSHA to identify secondary traumatic stress as a workplace hazard. This testimony will highlight information about OSHA protection, how to secure it, and why Philadelphia could become a national leader for taking care of its workers by proposing OSHA guidelines for secondary traumatic stress. Appendix B provides excerpts from the OSHA Act of 1970, specifically relevant to secondary traumatic stress and to resiliency programs. It includes the appendix also relevance of the OSHA Workplace Violence website to secondary traumatic stress and the benefits of secondary traumatic stress and resiliency programs to the workplace and the worker. Why OSHA protection? OSHA exists to help us protect our workers and communities. It sets standards that our diverse departments follow to take care of workers. It has recommendations which are not required but provide a guide for protection. How is it secured? In a telephone conversation with Maureen Ruskin, Deputy Director, Directorate for Standards and Guidance, Occupational Safety and Health Administration in Washington, I learned that the way to secure OSHA protection is by writing a letter to bring secondary traumatic stress to light and ask OSHA to consider the request that it be regulated. Anyone can write the letter, which serves as a petition. It must be robust. Her follow-up written communication cited the article that sets the parameters for a letter of petition, which is in Appendix A. There are two options for OSHA request, a website and a rule. They're not mutually exclusive. Both can be requested. The regulating process can take 7 years. A website can be created immediately. In my conversation with her also, I mentioned, and I failed to put this in my written testimony, hopefully can go in other, the recording of it, or our group can make sure that you add it. I told her about Caregivers film and how that had been the catalyst for these hearings, and asked if they might like to see that, and she said absolutely. So I would recommend that if this step is taken, that also be sent along with any other materials. Philadelphia, a national leader for taking care of its workers. Deputy Director Ruskin said that secondary traumatic stress has never come to OSHA's attention. She said that there's an OSHA website for emergency responders focused on physical safety, but they had not looked at psychological safety. She said that there are areas where a standard for secondary traumatic stress might fit in. I was directed to Deputy Director Ruskin by the Philadelphia office, where I was told that getting secondary traumatic stress petition would be at the national policy level. Not only is securing OSHA protection for Philadelphia's professional caregivers and first responders the most efficient, effective, and comprehensive route to protect them from the effects of workplace exposure to others' trauma, providing employees with safe and healthful workplaces is the law. Philadelphia's professional caregivers and first responders have a right to protection from workplace harm. We invite you, Philadelphia City Council, to initiate the process to secure that right by submitting a letter of petition to request a new standard which would create national policy to regulate secondary traumatic stress as a workplace hazard, not only in the city of Philadelphia, but across the nation. Be the trailblazer. Start now by requesting that a secondary traumatic stress worksite be created to inform the public while OSHA goes through the regulating process. Make Philadelphia the leader. Do that, and I will say happily with gratitude, hats off to you, Philadelphia City Council.
I want to thank both of the council people here, Helen Gim and Derek Green, for not only this public hearing, which is so significant, I think, but also the declaration of Caregivers and First Responders Day, which I think sets the right tone for our city, the validation of these workers who are doing so much to take care of our citizenry, and also the recognition that they too, as caregivers, need to be taken care of. And that's really what we're talking about today. And I'm going to kind of cut to the chase because you've both been here and others in the room a long time, and rather than giving you one more story, because you've heard a lot of really illustrative stories, I want to share a little bit more about the context nationally, particularly on this subject, and also to cite a few characteristics of programs that we believe are effective, and particularly in response to some of your questions about the culture of an agency and how does one begin to embed that, so we're not just sending people out to get help as if they had a pathological or psychological problem, but how do we begin to change the culture? So those will be the areas that I'll concentrate on very briefly. In the extensive packet that I believe you will have access to, if not already in your hands, there is a reference to two pieces of legislation which you can read more detail about, but one of them is a landmark legislation by the state of Colorado on behalf of their child welfare workers. And indeed, they created a task force that provides substantive and technical support to their county agencies specifically to address secondary trauma. This is the first piece of legislation that we're aware of that singles its focus, really shines the light on secondary trauma and provides the resources and the know-how to the county agencies to create their own programs. The second landmark piece of legislation was signed just this October at the federal level, and it also embodies the validity of the trauma-informed research and also the validation of the brain science, the kind of things that Dr. Sandra Bloom was talking about. Both of these pieces of legislation set the stage for what I think we could do here in the city, and it's my hope that in 2019, in consultation with both of your offices and some others, that we will be able to make recommendations to our various departments. Several characteristics of effective programs. The first is to normalize the phenomenon rather than treating it as a mental health problem, because that scares the workers at all levels away from seeking treatment. The referral of help outside of the agency and needing to go through a referral process is also very inhibiting. So what we find seems to work best is when there is intensive training at all levels, administrators, supervisors, workers, secretaries, anyone in these helping agencies, especially beginning with the new hires, because they are the most vulnerable and the most naive about what to expect. And secondly, one way to embed it in an organization rather than just sending them out to even an excellent EAP, and I have no objection, nor do we, of EAPs. They can do excellent work, but to embed it in the culture means to have people on site who are trained and can facilitate actual mechanisms of support. And what do those look like? You could have a cadre, say, of a dozen peer counselors that are just like you as a worker, and they look for those signs and symptoms of secondary trauma, and they do that outreach. They don't wait for the person to say, okay, I think I need help. They, in a friendly, low-key, voluntary way, they reach out to their colleague, administrator to administrator, worker to worker, supervisor to supervisor, secretary to secretary, and they offer the process one-to-one of debriefing. That's one of the things that seems to really begin to help and change a culture. Another is to have those trained people in the agency who can lead support groups and can bring people together in a confidential manner in which they can talk. So this is a very different approach, and you need some volunteer, passionate professionals in those organizations, and for the program to be effective, they're going to need to have an allotment of a certain amount of their time, maybe 5% or 10%. It doesn't mean putting a lot of money into this program. It's sort of a hidden cost. It does cost something if you designate 3 people, say, in each section of a major department. But you train these people and you recognize what they're doing. It's not just a responsibility on top of everything else they're doing, but maybe they have a half a day or a day a week to actually carry out these programs. So this is what we find seems to work best. I think in the packet, you and your office folks and your wonderful aides can delve into all this more deeply. We're also available in the new year and would love to see the initiation of a process that seeks to embed and change the culture of these organizations in addition to the EAP work. Thank you so much for the chance to speak.
So good afternoon, and thank you again, Councilmembers Gim and Green, for giving us the honor of being here today. I realize I am the closer and stand between between us and lunch, so I too will keep my remarks very brief. I am Leslie Lieberman. I'm the Senior Director of Organizational Development and Training at the Health Federation of Philadelphia, and I also am a social worker, a profession that I truly love and value. So I know firsthand and from colleagues that secondary traumatic stress is real and serious, and my personal story is in my written testimony. But what I want to really jump to, because I think that it's been touched upon, but I really want to close with this, is that paying attention to secondary traumatic stress really means that we have to move beyond just workshops and checklists on self-care and beyond awareness building to really developing these comprehensive practices and policies that promote staff wellness and resilience. So self-care is inarguably important, but in my opinion, it places far too much responsibility for the problem on individual behavior change, and we all know how well that works. So we really need to shift a good percentage of that responsibility to organizations, systems, and policymakers to create the conditions that prevent and mitigate the impact of STS. So a couple models that I want to point out, I think that are doing some things like that in addition to what Vic said, is we need models like the Resiliency Alliance Project, which is developed for child welfare workers in New York City. The model focuses on preventing and decreasing STS by building a specific set of resilient skills and increasing social support among workers. It recognizes that long-term intervention is necessary, so it's an intensive 12-session model. Supervisors and workers are engaged in separate cohorts, and early evaluations of the model showed that those involved in it had reduced trauma-related activity, burnout, and attrition, and increased self-care and social support. We also need to conduct research on what works, and we know, and several people have mentioned, that good supervision is part of the solution. We practice at the Health Federation something called reflective supervision, and there's an organization in the UK that's been conducting research on reflective supervision to see if it's an efficacious model for preventing STS, and the initial results look good. On an even deeper level, people have already talked about this too, but we need things like a mix of caseloads and excellent benefits for physical and mental health care for employees. And we need to continue on the same path of being leaders in Philadelphia for policies like paid sick leave, family leave, flexible hours, workplace safety and living wage policies. And again, I want to commend the work that has already happened. And I think we also need to kind of really be reflective about our organizations and think about what does it really mean to be a safe organization and to have that culture that promotes staff wellness and resilience. So thinking about things about inclusivity, culturally and racially diverse, being transparent, democratic, tolerating differences of opinion, encouraging dialogue about challenging issues, and making sure that everyone gets high-quality supervision. So at the Health Federation, where we also are the backbone organization from the Philadelphia ACE Task Force, we are committed to being a trauma-informed organization and helping others work toward that goal. So we know that we can only achieve that goal with a full commitment to addressing STS through individual, system, and policy change. We applaud the City Council for holding these hearings today, and we are here to partner with you to move this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony, and thank everyone for being here today. This has been a great conversation. I have some closing comments, but I'll let my colleagues make any statements that they would like at this point.
I would like to thank Councilman Green and Councilman Gem for all the work they've done on this subject. When I stepped out, I had one of my regular clients who lives in PHA who had the opposite problem. He's been in a wheelchair. Well, I've known him for close to 20 years now, and he's been in a wheelchair for about maybe 18 years. Got married about 8 years ago, and the opposite happened to him. His wife has decided she doesn't want all that goes with his illness. So we were out there trying to talk to him and keep his spirits up. So unfortunately, we have good people like all of you, and then we have some people who God has to somehow touch so that they realize what a blessing it is to take care of people we love. So thank you all, and thank my two colleagues for all they've done in this matter. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilwoman, and thank you, Councilman Green. I just want to thank this panel for your history of work in this area. It's been really valuable, and I've enjoyed working with you, Vic, for many years. But in this world, it's in this space, which you are an expert in, it's also wonderful to be able to work with you. Thank you.
And just to close, I will once again thank all of the panelists for participating in this hearing today. And just looking at some of my notes, I see some action items that we can take. One of the concepts that Dr. Davis, you talked about, a letter or a petition. I could see possibly council doing a resolution calling on OSHA to come up with guidelines for secondary trauma, which I think that's something that could be doable by this body. I'm not sure if we can get it done next week, which is our last session of council, but I think that's something
Week
that...
after will be all right.
Right, but I think that's something as we go into the new year, we have the calendar for, city council said that, I think that's something as a body people will be supportive of, and I think that type of resolution will be robust to bring attention to the issue from an OSHA perspective. In addition, listen to both Deputy Commissioner Yates and Sergeant White. It sounds like the police department have a very robust organization, also Local 22 from the firefighters and also the Valiants, as well as Lodge 5 FOP. They provide a peer opportunity, but it doesn't seem like there's that same peer opportunity in other departments of the city. Listening to what Mr. Williams talked about from DHS, having an outside subcontractor provide that type of service could be something that we look at for other city departments to provide an opportunity for those who are dealing with secondary trauma can receive those type of services beyond EAP, and maybe that organization may have the ability to help pull together volunteers in various departments to provide those services. As an attorney, I think about there's some organizations that have been started. One in particular, Lawyers Caring for Lawyers, that has been active both with the Philadelphia Bar Association and the Pennsylvania Bar Association, who are dealing with lawyers who have substance abuse issues, and that just started out of attorneys that saw some of their fellow attorneys having those challenges with substance abuse, and that's become a robust type of organization to help lawyers help other lawyers who are dealing with those issues. And so maybe working with the Deep Road Group and looking at those opportunities of trying to create those type of peer entities within various city departments. And then also, we talked a lot about awareness. One of the things that I could possibly see is crafting some type of webinar type thing that can be put together that can be sent out to city employees for those who can watch on their own time when they have an opportunity to try to educate people about this whole concept of secondary trauma. And that's something I can also see partnering with the Attorney General's office and some of the work I do with Pennsylvania Municipal League and taking that to other cities as well. So hearings are always, from my perspective, a good opportunity to get an exchange of information and ideas. You provide a lot of information. I think it's helpful for myself, and I would venture for other members of this body, and we'll try to get this information out to other members of City Council, as well as city employees and those who are working or related to city employees, as well as they deal with these issues of secondary trauma. So thank you for your input, and your advocacy is very well appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last part, I'm sorry. This hearing on this resolution will be recessed to the call of the chair.